everyone. Covers Daily, Wednesday, January 26th, 72 hours. 96 hours, 72 hours. What day is it? I don't know anymore. Sunday. Conference Championship Finals, AFC, NFC. We're getting close. I know that. Days are counting down. The games are dwindling down. Just 3 more games to potentially find bets, and then a whole lot of props being released 1 week from today, where we will be breaking down more props than you can count on a daily basis beginning next Wednesday, with guests, with people coming in from sports books. We'll have a lot of coverage of props and additional markets leading up to the Super Bowl. But we've got to get to 2 games this Sunday, and we'll have Sommer joining us again, one of the more respected bettors when it comes to the NFL, has a lot of market influence himself. He's going to be joining us at the bottom of the hour, about 12:30 p.m. Eastern time from Germany, to break down both the AFC and NFC championships. So very much looking forward to what he has to say. For those of you that watched the show last week, a very comfortable win with him on the Los Angeles Rams. Speaking of market influence, tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, something I'm very excited for, the RAS Right Angle Sports release show will debut here on Covers. Right Angle Sports are one of the most respected betting groups, perhaps the most respected betting group when it comes to college basketball in the United States. Their market influence has been well documented for the last 20 to 25 seasons. They're having a phenomenal year this year, and we're going to be bringing them on, not directly, but their releases. And so anybody who's watching the show tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Eastern will be able to bet at the same time that they are betting as well. And it's pretty incredible to see what happens when they release a bet. Anybody who's able to react quick enough, and it absolutely is a race. It's going to be a very fun thing to put on air and to see. But anybody who does bet it at the same time, you're getting 2, 3, 4 points within a matter of minutes of value to where the line ultimately moves. So it's going to be fun to see what they have to send out tomorrow morning, as well as how many people are going to be able to bet it at the same number. And we'll talk about what it all means, break down the value, and really get you ahead of a number or two tomorrow for college basketball. And then in subsequent weeks, we'll do it every Thursday and Saturday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern. That will become the release time through the first week of March Madness. So definitely a show that you do not want to miss, whether or not you are a college basketball fan. It's a show that you want to be there for, and a show you want to be looking at. Before I get into both games and sort of wrapping up some thoughts on some market movements, as well as looking forward to some of these Super Bowl look-ahead lines, which have now been posted, just before we came on air, if anybody is watching in the comments, maybe you can help me out here. Producer Brady, big NASCAR bettor, extremely good at it, and he's able to spot prices, huge fan of the sport. It was like 30 seconds before we went live, he sent me a link of what's happening next week at the Coliseum in Los Angeles, and I don't understand it. And so if he can pull up the picture, I'll spend a minute on this, but someone needs to help me understand this. So that's a football stadium. And he's trying to explain to me that there are going to be 10 cars racing each other in the same area that they play football. So first of all, I don't understand how that's necessarily okay, because it's not like those cars are going particularly slow. And to me, fitting something in, look at this. This is insane. And so this is happening. But my big question here is, like, they're racing on pavement, and there's a football field under there. So can somebody, if you're in the comments, explain this? First of all, what happens to the football field? Because as far as I was aware, there's grass under there. So, like, where does the football field go, first of all? But second, like, how many people are working after the pavement is laid down to remove the pavement? Because it's not like you're just rolling this up and taking it out. Like, they're racing on paved concrete. So, like, people have to come in and jackhammer this out, and then, like, wheelbarrow or dump truck it out of the Coliseum, and then the grass underneath is somehow fine. I don't know if somebody has answers to this. I would love to know in the comments, because this, to me, I don't know how this is possible. And it seems like the most unnecessary thing of all time. But apparently Larson is worth betting on from the expert himself. So I don't know. We're not necessarily turning this into a NASCAR show, but they just shared to me like it's fresh in mind just before we went on air, and I don't understand it. So if anyone has answers to this, I would love to know in the YouTube comments, or you can send me a message on Twitter, because this to me is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen. But hey, maybe it's fun for a lot of people to watch on next week. I'm not one to debate with the ratings that the sport ultimately draws. To a sport that has no issues with ratings, moving on to the NFL Conference Championships, a little bit of market movement to talk about, actually. It is Wednesday, and it's not like it's the typical Wednesday limit bumps that we see during the regular season. I mean, within 10 minutes of these games opening, there were books taking 25K aside and 10 to 15K a total. So it's like usually in a regular week, you get to Wednesday morning, some of that movement looks a lot different because of who is waiting to bet at that time and where they are ultimately betting into. Not necessarily the case with Conference Championship week, but even to see when it happened this morning, it was too early for it to be any speculation on injuries. It was also too early for it to be any sort of speculation on any news as well. There's nothing that's really come out in the last 12 to 24 hours. So we're clearly seeing that there are just a couple of positions being taken in the market. First one I think is noteworthy because it's relative to a bet that I put in the bet thread earlier this week, and I think a lot of people watching the show are already on, is the Cincinnati Kansas City over. That got bet up last night at Circa specifically to 55. And if you see Circa moving first on a number, it's very obvious the clientele that bet into that book, and it's very obvious how respected that clientele would have to be to move an NFL championship total midweek. So to see them moving first, they went up to 55. Rest of the market followed. This morning, we saw that go back the other way. So we're now down to 54.5, and some other places have gone to 54. And why the initial move to me was more telling than the move back is because the move back is very easy to explain. When it gets into the playoffs specifically, but nevertheless, Conference Championship weekend, when you see a total this high, there are going to be people that run numbers, have models that are just always going to justify that any number in the mid-50s is way too high, and they're going to auto bet the under. And so when we're thinking about kind of key numbers within the 50s, 51 and 54, they stand out slightly more than the other numbers. They have somewhat more relevance in terms of the value that they hold, with totals anywhere you're looking like 2 to 3% at most per number. These are up there. When we get to a 55, there's going to be people just blindly betting the under, especially in a week like this, because they're just looking at it and saying that's too high and just betting the under on price alone. But to me, the move on the over is not something that you typically see early in the week, especially after what we saw occur following the open. Some places were as low as 50.5, and within 20 minutes after open, it was bet up to 53.5. And so there was already that initial move on the over. To me, the one that came last night was just sort of further justification for that position, with just people that are getting more down at certain books at certain times during the week. So I feel like that move to the over is pretty telling within this game. Obviously, if you were following the bet thread, you know that I feel the same way. I saw an interesting tweet this morning about the Kansas City Chiefs defense, which was interesting because if you look at the last, the sample was 6 games towards the end of the regular season, including the playoffs. And sort of the angle that was being taken on there was how some of the defensive numbers on a team that's actually fell off. They had that streak from like the Giants game on Monday night around like week 7 until about week 13, where they played really weak opponents, but the defense got healthy. They found the pass rush. They started playing very aggressively, and they had a lot of success. But then towards the end of the season, they kind of fell off, especially in coverage. They allowed some big games. And the numbers, in a way, tend to be skewed a little bit because of the 2 Pittsburgh games. So if you're removing Big Ben and the Steelers' offense, which was by far the worst that they faced in this stretch, you're looking at a team that over the last 6 weeks has allowed on average 30 points a game and a little over 400 yards conceded per game. So a bit of a different way to look at the Chiefs defense, which I thought was interesting. What we heard from Eric Eager yesterday was, I thought, interesting too, because, and especially in conference championships, let alone any other game during the regular season, there's always justification for both sides of a side and both sides of a total. And it's easy to sort of get with 2 games on the board into a spot where you're overanalyzing everything and you kind of turn into like an echo chamber where you're just repeating the same things you want to hear and not seeing the other side of it. And I came on yesterday's show before we had Eric on, and I was explaining how the difference for me and the Chiefs between the first meeting where they scored 31 on Cincinnati and what they have this game is that in that first meeting, Travis Kelce was just off the COVID list for a week of no practice. And we've seen over the course of the year, any player who doesn't get in a practice week coming off of the COVID list, their impact on the game of production falls off a cliff in that first game back. So that was very much the issue with Kelce. But also the Chiefs did not play Jerick McKinnon. In the last 3 to 4 weeks, he's become a pretty integral part of the Chiefs defense Chiefs offense, as opposing defenses play a lot softer, force them to go underneath. As we saw against Buffalo, Mahomes didn't attempt to pass more than 20 yards downfield. Obviously, McKinnon is a big piece of that, as he's open nearly every single play as that safety valve. So those 2 guys are obviously going to be in this game against the Bengals. Just so happens Cincinnati, the worst team in the NFL when you combine passes allowed to tight ends and running backs. And so if you're thinking about how Cincinnati might defend, forcing Kansas City underneath, that's actually where the Bengals are the weakest. And so that was kind of my take. And then Eric Eager comes in, who's brilliant. And what he's talking about is that may very well be the case, but what that does is naturally shorten the game. So even against the Bills, who are a terrific offense and their defense is built to defend a team like Kansas City, in that first half, there were only 4 possessions per team, and one of those possessions was at the very end of half that forced KC with the missed field goal, but they were rushing in their 2-minute drill. So you really only got about 7 true possessions in that first half. The second half played a little bit slower until that urgency kicked in late, and then the game got out of control. But although that may be the weakness of Cincinnati when it comes to how you ideally want to defend Kansas City, they can still be effective enough, according to Eric, that it's going to slow down the explosiveness of the Chiefs. And so I think it's a very interesting 2-sided handicap when you're looking at the total, because on one hand, you can look at it and say, it's the weakness of the Bengals. The Chiefs are very efficient now at moving the football underneath. We've seen this offense evolve, and it's a very different scenario now that you have the 2 key guys back who can attack the weakness of Cincinnati. But on the other hand, you can't ignore the fact that how Cincinnati wants to defend the Chiefs is a way that historically and so typically would lead to a much slower paced game, where if you're only looking at 8 possessions a half and the total's in the mid-50s, you need a lot of things to fall correctly and go right in order to exceed that total. So that's kind of the 2-sided handicap on the total when it relates to this game that I think is something very interesting to consider. We still don't have the props up yet, widely available. Those will come a little bit later today. So we'll see what some of those numbers open at. But as it's laid out, you kind of want to be looking in obviously the directions of backs and tight ends when it comes to KC. If you want to look on covers, we actually have a props comparison tool that you can find on the right-hand side of the odds page that's free for everybody to use. You can shuffle through teams, players, and markets, and you can look at all the regulated books in your state in terms of what they have available for different players, and you can compare everything and find what the best price is for those specific players. So if you're looking at props this week or next week, this is a really handy tool to use. Again, it's free for everybody. You can look at all the books in your states for those numbers. When it comes to San Francisco, Los Angeles, we actually, just before going on air, saw a little bit of money come in on the under. It, for the most part, was hanging around the 46, and that is now down to 45.5 at a couple of places. Some key books are still holding on to 46, but they're shading to the under. I've posted the clip, and it's of the time we've done covers daily here since the playoffs got started. It was one of the most popular clips, and I think justifiably so. The breakdown that Eric gave on this game, to me, was absolutely fascinating. You could see my face while I was doing it. Like, I didn't know, my head was exploding on air because the breakdown that he gave was great. So if you want to watch that clip in its entirety, you can go back and look at it. But I'll give the sort of short version for those of you who may not have seen it. I was asking him why the 49ers have had so much success against the Rams, and it's got to be more than just the coaching mismatch, which all the media is talking about this week. Shanahan owns McVay. I was pressing him, and I was like, why is that? Like, what's happening within these games that allows Shanahan and the 49ers to have so much success against LA? And his reasoning was very simple. He said, look, the 49ers run the highest rate of pre-snap motion in the NFL. And if you're watching the 49ers games, you can see it, right? You see all the guys in motion. You see the usage of Juszczyk. You can see the usage of Samuel. There's a lot going on pre-snap, and that's kind of what Shanahan is known for. And so it's very easy to see. But the second point that he made was the reason that it's so effective against the Rams is because the LA defense disguises their coverage at the highest rate of any team in the NFL. And so what that means effectively is that the Rams defense pre-snap to post-snap is in motion. It's really just changing a coverage, but for comparison's sake, we'll call it motion at the highest rate too. And so when you put this Rams defense on the field against the Niners offense, which uses so much pre-snap motion on offense, it causes the Rams defense to really change how they want to defend, and it eliminates that advantage of being able to disguise things as much as they do from a coverage perspective. And the more static a defense is, the easier it is for opposing quarterbacks to read it and understand who is doing what. And so just by the way that the 49ers run their offense, it really negates a lot of the advantages that the Rams have from the way they can communicate and the schemes that they play defensively and the schemes that they show pre-snap. And so it's just a really weird matchup in terms of how that's dictated. And another thing he pointed out was the Rams play with the fewest guys in the box on average per snap of any team. If you think about how the 49ers run their offense, obviously there's a lot of effectiveness on the ground with multiple running backs and how they're able to utilize them within the running game. If the Rams don't naturally sell out to stop that to begin with, the motion that the 49ers do sort of force them to still be honest, and that allows for big run opportunities. And so it's a really interesting matchup that kind of from a media perspective falls at face level at just the coaches' names and the previous history. But there's seldom like a further dive in to why this is happening. And I thought he articulated that exceptionally well. He also said that he was leaning to the over. And just thinking about that all together with that matchup, which I thought was fascinating, but also the fact that we were seeing this total at 46 and now 45.5. That's lower than what we saw a couple weeks ago when it closed 47 between these two teams. And then when they played earlier in the year, I believe the game was in October, that closed 51. And so we're now significantly lower than where we were in both of those two games. Yet the matchup advantages on field schematically between the two teams, that still all exists. And so I'm sort of questioning why we're sort of lower to that extent. And the first obvious reason, if you're trying to play both sides of the handicap here, is when teams meet for a third time in the playoffs, all of those games historically have trended towards the under. There hasn't been a massive sample size of those games, but they all trend under. And the same thing is true for the second time round within the division. the second meeting within a division is always a situation that, from a betting perspective, tends to trend under. And we saw that adjustment somewhat priced in the second meeting between these two teams, which needed overtime to get over the total. And so there's that natural sort of look, again, when we're tying these playoff games back to guys that just run numbers, there's always some value on situation that'll weight it for them. So when you're thinking about the way that this game sets up as a third meeting in the playoffs, the familiarity between the two teams, a lot of people are going to look at this playoff game and just naturally sort of have a projection that's lower. And again, we're seeing a lot of that somewhat priced in, as this is the lowest we've seen between these two teams, and it's continuing to trend slightly lower within the market. I think another thing that can't be ignored is obviously the health of Jimmy Garoppolo. We saw the 49ers against the Packers defense, which on paper, very similar to the Rams, was a defense that we expected the 49ers to have a lot of success against. If you think about what the Packers were, it was one of the worst run defenses in the NFL, a team that plays very small in the mid-level of the defense, and how the Niners work, that was expected to be a very favorable matchup for them. 49ers in that game scored 6 points on offense. The rest of the points came off of the block kick and a field goal. And so that, no question, I think has to bring this total down just a little bit further too, because offensively they had a very good matchup and they weren't able to execute. So there's always an element of what we've seen last within these games. And so I think that's certainly being factored in here too. And we don't know how healthy Jimmy Garoppolo ultimately is. He was very restricted in how many passes he was even allowed to throw in that game against Green Bay, let alone actually throw. And I mean, if you're watching him, as divisive as a quarterback as he might be, I would be sort of lying if I was sitting here and saying that there was anything comfortable about what we saw from his performance. I mean, there were a number of throws that you're just holding your breath on as he lets go of the football. Because on TV, you're watching and you're like, this has got to be a pick six going the other way. And he got away with a couple of those that could have one turnover off of any of those plays switches that game entirely. And so that's certainly factoring in here. My counter to that, and part of the reason why I've bet on the over, aside from that, is we're seeing the lower numbers. So some of that is priced into an extent. But what does that look like in a much different environment this week? Lambeau Field, late Saturday night, extreme cold, snow on the field. It kind of potentially, from a health perspective, limited what Garoppolo may have been able to do or may have been comfortable doing. And it also may have sort of condensed the playbook and allowed the Packers defensively to approach it as a little bit more of a one-dimensional look. Now we're going to be indoors. It's San Francisco practicing in facilities comfortably the entire week in the same medical facilities that they're used to, knowing that they have a very short trip to go to LA in a spot where they're familiar with, but more importantly, putting both of these teams on a fast surface indoors at SoFi Stadium. So to me, it's a very different set of circumstances this week for where these two teams are going to be playing and how that ultimately matches up and looks. And I think to an extent, what was also ignored was, as good as this 49ers defense was playing, especially up front within the pass rush, that was a Packers offensive line that was banged up and had a lot of issues. And so there were advantages for those edge pass rushers. And I know with the Rams, there's the Whitworth injury concerns. Noteboom stepped in and played very well. I think that pass rush for the Niners is negated a little bit within this matchup. And so it'll be, to me, sort of a situation where a lot of the things that were in that matchup against Green Bay don't necessarily exist to the same extent within this matchup as the Rams offensive line can, I think, negate the pass rush. But then it's like, well, what happens to this 49ers secondary? We know that that's sort of the one big liability that they have. And we're sort of waiting for that game where there's that big impact to the secondary. And if you're watching the Rams the last couple of weeks, when they choose to throw the football, especially on early downs, with the emergence of OBJ within that lineup, they've been extremely effective at throwing. And I'm waiting for Suma to sort of dive back and look in and get a really good understanding of what happens when this Rams offense elects not to throw the football on early downs and not be taking the more efficient route. And when they choose to run it, it's a very big drop off and a very big difference for this offense entirely. And so, knowing the familiarity between these two teams, as much as I expect Shanahan to continue what he has done against the Rams that they've had so much success doing, and Jimmy Garoppolo to actually have a very effective game passing the football, more so than the Niners just running all over LA. I think it's a big passing game for San Francisco. I think the Rams, at least early, until they potentially build a lead, like we saw against the Buccaneers, and then switch. But at least early, the game plan is going to be to throw on this Niners secondary, which is something that I think that they can do. So I think this game is going to be very competitive back and forth, but I think the total is just getting too low. And so I was happy to bet the over with it yesterday. And I just have to wonder if it's come ultimately too low. So we're going to get Suma in here in just a second. Left him hanging without a link, and so I have to send it over to him. But he's very good at looking at these early down situations. And if you were following him on Twitter, he was with me. He was with Rob Pizzola. He was with a lot of smart folks who were all critical of McVay in terms of how he approached that second half when he built up the lead. And to me, it was like the big storyline of the entire divisional weekend that sort of got lost amid all of the excitement, the late finishes, the overtime game to end the week, was just how bad of a coaching malpractice from a play calling perspective that actually was to let Tampa Bay back in the game. And it's not something that has entirely been disregarded too, because it happened against the 49ers earlier in the week. Question here from G Prime 19, or rather a comment. We'll come back to NASCAR before we have Suma in just a second here. I'm reading that they've done a race at Marlins Park in Miami, and they lay down a plastic material that protects the field and then 50,000 square feet of metal plates to provide a solid surface. It took 48 hours after to remove the track and then re-laser and lay down fresh turf. So it sounds like they only do it before they want to replace everything. So, but what is it? Like, plastic what? I don't understand. They're putting concrete on it. It doesn't matter how much plastic you stack up. Like, there's still going to be, I don't get it. And then surely it kills everything underneath, because you see in places around, if they're going to build houses or neighborhoods, I mean, they spend weeks packing and tamping down the foundation before they end up pouring anything or letting it set, because if they don't, then it's a complete mess. And so you're telling me with plastic and metal plates, they can get to a point where they're comfortable letting cars drive like 200 miles per hour on plastic and metal plates? Like, why is this not talked about more? To me, this is a big thing. I don't understand it. We've got Suma, who I don't know if he's going to help us understand the pouring and setting of asphalt and concrete, but I think you'll help us understand a little bit more about these conference championship games. Have you seen what they're doing at the LA Coliseum? Is this news to you too?
I had no clue what you were talking about, to be honest.
Okay. Brady, pull up the picture one more time. We'll show Suma what's going on. Go back to the picture. So, like where USC plays their football games in the Coliseum.
Yeah.
Brady, bring up the picture. So they're having, in a football stadium, a NASCAR race. Look at this.
Okay.
So they're pouring asphalt and concrete to obviously make a racetrack within the stadium. My question was, first of all, how is like space-wise, how is this okay? But second, like, what happens to the field underneath, and how do they just remove this in the matter of like a day or two? I've got you on the spot, but I got caught with it 2 seconds before we came on air, and I can't get my head around it. Like, there's going to be cars going hundreds of miles an hour inside of a football stadium.
I would guess that there needs to be a pretty thick level separating the field and that NASCAR ground. Otherwise, it doesn't really look too bode well for the field, to be honest.
Would you be comfortable sitting front row to that?
Probably not.
This is wild to me. So we were having some comments of folks trying to explain it, but it goes next Saturday. So I'm legitimately going to watch just to see how this all works out. How's conference championship weekend treating you so far?
To be honest, I think it's cool to have only 2 games on deck to think about. I think we talked about it after the regular season. It's pretty cool to not have 16 games every week to follow and check injury news all day long. So I think after 18 weeks, it's pretty cool to have only a few premium games on the deck, especially after that crazy divisional round last weekend. I mean, Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, the Rams and the Niners, Shanahan and McVay. What more could you ask for?
It worked out well considering that, like, a couple of weeks ago, there was the potential to have, like, the Saints in the playoffs. There was the potential that, like, it could have been really bad, but for how the matchup shook down, like, I think we're getting as entertaining and great of 2 matchups as we can. Are we not?
Yes, absolutely. Just imagine, I mean, to be honest, the Saints with Taysom Hill, they wouldn't have made the championship round.
No way.
So, no way. So, but I mean, maybe we would have gotten like a Cowboys Saints matchup, and that would not have been very cool. So I'm glad that the Niners beat the Rams in Week 18, and we can be witnesses of the greatness that is Kyle Shanahan.
Okay, but on the other side, there's Sean McVay, who you've been critical, as have I, especially in the second half of the Bucs game. And you bet on the Rams. Last week on the show, you were talking about it. Obviously, you had some influence in bringing that number down. For everybody watching that may have been caught up in the fumbles or the turnovers, break down what happened there. And then you had a fantastic tweet this morning as well.
Yeah, so I could not understand that. We talked about the matchup last week on this show. The Buccaneers don't have a great pass defense. And the Rams, what they do well is throwing the ball on early downs, particularly on early downs. So it was a good matchup for the Rams to attack that secondary, go deep, hit Cooper Kupp and Odell Beckham. And that worked out very well to start the game. And it was also a major reason why the Rams got an early lead. But over the course of the game, even though the passing game was working very well, McVay called, like, I stopped counting at some point. I think I would say it was like 20 or more early down runs, but for no reason. They could not run the ball at all on that Bucs front, and that's been a common theme over the past couple of weeks. Cam Akers coming back from his Achilles injury in Week 18, amazing. Really, kudos to all the medical staff, to Cam Akers for coming back basically half a year after tearing that Achilles. But that run game for the Rams has been horrendous since he's back. And like you said, I tweeted it out earlier today. I was just checking how the Rams are or were running the ball on early downs since Cam Akers came back into the lineup. And since he did that against the Niners in Week 18, against the Cardinals, and against the Bucs. To be fair, we have to say that the Niners and the Bucs have a pretty good run defense that plays into the equation. But even then, it's even harder to understand why McVay goes so run heavy against those teams. But however, since Cam Akers is back, the Rams have run the ball 80 times on early downs, on first or second down in those 3 games. And the result, even after excluding turnovers, I especially took away all the fumbles, because fumbling the ball is a pretty big EPA swing on a small sample size.
Sure.
So I didn't even include the fumbles. And even without the fumbles, the Rams, since Cam Akers is back, are averaging minus 0.28 EPA per rush, 2.9 yards per carry, and have a success rate of only 23.7% on early down runs. For comparison, all those metrics would rank dead last over the course of the season. They have a worse run game than the Houston Texans since Cam Akers is back in the lineup on early downs. And I also checked his PFF grade. Cam Akers last year, pretty solid rookie season. He had a rushing grade of, let me check, 77.6 last season. This season, in those 3 games, he's below 40.
Wow.
And that in the constraints of the Sean McVay offense with a solid offensive line and what is supposed to be a great run scheme, it doesn't make any sense. So I can't tell you what McVay is thinking. Maybe he's thinking, oh, I've got Cam Akers back. I've got Sony Michel, who they've been traded for earlier in the season. Maybe he's saying, hey, I have all those guys back. I want to get back to running the football. I don't know why he does it, but the run game has been absolutely terrible since that Week 18 game against the Niners.
So just to bring it all together, with Akers in the lineup since Week 18, early down runs, the Rams are running at a rate that is the worst in the NFL comparatively to any team in the entire regular season.
Not just Akers, also Sony Michel, but
everyone
since Cam
else.
Akers is back. Yes.
And I think it's important, like 2.9 yards per carry is more than a yard below what we would consider like an average running game. But that success rate, for people that don't know, first down, you need 4 yards or more for a successful run. Second down, you need 4 yards or more for a successful run. And so when you're looking at that 23%, if we're talking about like an average running game in the NFL, we're like mid 40s. And so you're looking at 23%. That's going to be as bad as you're ever going to find. And so it just illustrates how bad those run plays are.
Yeah, I have to say that this success rate that I have pulled is not the traditional success rate, but it's just saying that whether a run has been positive EPA or negative EPA. So for every run that basically gains expected points on a single play, that would be considered a successful run, and if not, it's 0. So basically, not only 1/4 of their run plays has been or has netted any positive expected points on the field.
So for those watching, just wondering why you're singling out first and second down, and we'll say, like, what about third down? What about fourth down? What's going on there? Why are first and second down so important to you when you're watching and betting?
Because that's a much bigger sample size than third downs. We will always see that the good offenses in the league are more successful on third down than the bad ones. For example, like Patrick Mahomes, as long as that offense is like it is, they will always be way more successful on third downs than an average team. But small third downs usually have a much smaller sample size. And what teams do on early downs, on first and second down, usually is more predictive when you try to predict future games or when you try to predict anything going forward. So early downs, first and second down is more stable than third downs, and third downs can be much more dependent on variance, so to speak. So for example, the Rams, they are running very poorly on early downs, and that led to them having in general a worse efficiency on early downs because they're also running more. So their passing game is working, but if you call more runs, or let's say more than 50% runs, which McVay has been doing lately, then your overall efficiency on early downs drops, and your quarterback will be more often into those third down situations. And Matthew Stafford has been very good on third downs lately. Against the Niners in Week 18, he had some incredible third down conversions to basically go ahead and make this game 73 at some point in the second quarter. And also last week, we remember that 3rd and 20 touchdown bomb to Cooper Kupp. He made some really, really good throws on third down. And I wonder how sustainable that is, especially when you play that 49ers front seven.
And I think it's an interesting point to bring up, an important one too, because for anybody that's watching that might just be the average everyday bettor, or they're just a big NFL fan, if you watch an NFL broadcast, like, what do we hear about? It's third down conversion. It's what have they done on fourth down. First and second tend to sort of be ignored. But like you said, that's the bigger sample, but it's also more predictive of what an offense can do and how good they might be. But it also gives you sort of an insight, especially early in the games, into how coaches are approaching their game plan, does it not?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in a perfect world, as an offense, you don't want to have any third downs. You want to move the ball on early downs and just try to avoid those third downs because you want to keep drives alive. And the more efficient you are on early downs, the more efficient you are when it comes to scoring points. So, yeah, it's been pretty wild to dive into those numbers because when I watched the game last week against the Bucks, I mean, I was on Rams +3. And when it was 27-3, I tweeted out that, oh, I'm glad they didn't make it 28.3, 28-3. And that almost turned into the biggest jinx of the century. And yeah, and I would say that a big reason why we needed to sweat that game at all in the end was because Sean McVay tried to establish the one. For whatever reason, it was not working. And that put the Rams into some very bad situations. They had a lot of 3-and-outs. They had those fumbles. I mean, those fumbles were pretty random. But in general, I would have liked to see the Rams just closing out the game with a little bit more passing on early downs.
So we saw McVay do a very similar thing in Week 18 against the 49ers where he had a 3-score lead. The Niners come back, ultimately win, and secure their playoff spot. When you're looking at round 3 between these two teams coming up on Sunday, what are you seeing stand out in your mind from the market or the matchup itself?
From the market, first of all, it's pretty interesting. I bet the Niners 3.5 earlier in the week, and there's been some very strong resistance. So as soon as the market tries to go towards 3, there's some instant buyback on the Rams, which is pretty interesting to say the least. I would say that George Kittle and Deebo Samuel will be fine. Trent Williams is a question mark. But Trent Williams was also not available on that Week 18 game. And in Week 18, we had a lot more, I would call it, uncertainty about Jimmy Garoppolo's thumb. Now, coming off that first half against Dallas, we know that the thumb is not the biggest issue. It's an issue, but I would not call it that Jimmy cannot play at all or something like that. So there was some uncertainty back in Week 18, and that game also closed 3.5. So to see some big buyback, or let's say some big buys on the Rams at -3, -120, or -125 is pretty interesting to say the least.
It was,
yeah.
I was going to say, I can tell you who was betting on them, but maybe we'll save that for after the show. But where it's kind of sitting now, do you think that's a price that, do we close 3.5 or do we get to 4?
No clue, actually. Early in the week, I was pretty, let's say, confident that we will see 3 later in the week. That's also why I jumped early, because I didn't want to lose the 3.5. And now I'm just a little bit surprised that we didn't get to 3 yet. But as you have been indicating, there must be some major backing of the Rams.
On the field itself, you mentioned the offensive line. You mentioned Kittle and Samuel, who are going to be fine. Garoppolo, it seems to be, if anything's going to hold him back, it might be the shoulder, like you said, rather than the thumb. We had Eric Eager from PFF yesterday on the show, who gave like a really good breakdown. I guess what I'm curious about is, while everybody's looking at the running game of San Francisco, really the big thing in Week 18 was how effective Garoppolo was throwing it. Is there still the same potential for Jimmy to have a big game with this offense, despite everyone maybe looking to how they'll do running it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a very specific matchup advantage for the Niners. And I think we also saw it during the first 2 matchups for them. The Niners, and I think Eric explained it perfectly yesterday. The Niners are an offense. They have a very complex run game. They're also a team with a, let's say, run-first approach, but they have a very diverse and complex run game. And when it comes to passing the ball, they want to stretch defenses horizontally with all the motion they are doing, and then Shannon wants to create space over the middle for Jimmy Garoppolo to hit these specific routes over the middle, and they're very good at it. And when you look at passing heat maps for the 49ers, everything is funneled over the middle. Jimmy Garoppolo does not like throwing the ball outside the numbers. It's everything, not everything, but the bulk of the targets go over the middle, 0 until 15 to 20 air yards down the field. That's basically the bread and butter for the 49ers offense. And I just looked at some numbers earlier today. I just filtered all quarterbacks this year who have attempted at least 50 such passes over the middle of the field, 0 to 15 air yards. And I came up with 27 qualifying quarterbacks. Out of those, Jimmy Garoppolo ranks third in EPA per play and first in yards per play on those passes. And he has attempted the second most. So it's not really a big sample size issue here. So Jimmy Garoppolo and the Niners offense, they are very successful when throwing the ball over the middle of the field. And now we come to the other side. The Rams defense against exactly such passes on the season. 29th in DVOA,
Incredible.
28th in EPA per play, and 29th in yards per play. So it's like the perfect matchup for the 49ers passing offense when they play the Rams. And I think that's also what we saw over the first two games. And what's also interesting when we go back to these two first matchups is that the Niners won both games. The second one was basically a coin flip, but it was basically a third down variance that decided most of those games. In the first game, the Niners were very good on converting third downs. In the second game, it was Matthew Stafford who converted a lot of third downs, a lot of great third downs. But in both games, the Niners outgained the Rams by, I think, 0.18 EPA per play on early downs. So that Niners defense has really done a great job against the Rams, containing that run game, really taking away all those short passing routes. And I think that you mentioned it right before I jumped on the show, is that the way for the Rams to move the ball is attacking that defense vertically. But that Niners front seven is great. I think they have one of the highest pressure rates since the middle of the season.
Yep.
They have a very deep rotation. And what's also interesting is we talked about it last week. Matthew Stafford has been killing the blitz all season long. That's why I thought that he would have a good matchup against the blitzing Bucs defense. The Niners don't blitz at all. They have one of the lowest blitzing rates in the entire league. They just try to get home with four guys. They use a lot of stunts, lots of twists, and then they try to take away the first read. And that's also what got to Aaron Rodgers last week. And I think this is a pretty solid matchup against Matthew Stafford, who does not like when opposing defenses can create havoc with four guys. So do I think that the Niners defense will shut down the Rams? Not at all. But I think this is a completely different matchup for that Rams offense, just when we think about scheme and matchup.
Regardless of what happens on Sunday, but if the Niners happen to win, and we're leading up to the Super Bowl, and whatever happens in a couple of weeks does, but it's going to be hilarious to look back at the path that the Niners ended up getting throughout the playoffs to get to the Super Bowl. Because like if you're sort of handpicking opponents, like it's comical to an extent, where the Cowboys that was like ideal for what the Niners wanted to do, and they executed it perfectly. The Packers game, although that was kind of coin flippish in many different ways, but in terms of what the Packers struggled to do defensively versus how the Niners want to run offensively, like that was perfect. And now there's just this game, but between you and Eric this week, like it's bizarre how everything just kind of has set up for the Niners, not just on offense, but both sides of the football. And this is another week where it's crazy how the Rams built their defense to defend certain teams, and the Niners are just everything that they have not built their defense to defend.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we talked about it before the wildcard round, that the potential path for the Niners would be Cowboys, Packers, and maybe Rams or Bucs.
Yeah.
And I think we both agreed that the path of Dallas, Green Bay, Rams would be perfect for the Niners. And
Yep.
now it just played out that way. It's pretty funny.
Everything fell into place. On the other side, we have a second rematch too. It's the Bengals and Chiefs, a game that was very exciting down the stretch in the final week of the season. But we saw some ref assistance, I think, for the Bengals. We saw some big play luck, if we want to call it, on 3rd and 4th down, like you were referencing to. Those high leverage situations kind of went the way of the Bengals. What are you looking at here from the market and the matchup as we get into the AFC side?
Yeah, first of all, it was pretty interesting to see all those adjustments. I think in week 16, the Chiefs opened at around -5. You probably know better than me. And then later in the week, we had all that Bengals team that brought the game almost down to 3.
Yep.
I think that the Chiefs were -3, -120 at some point before some buyback. And the total, I was on the over that week, and I think I got something like 49 or so. And now we are looking at Chiefs -7 a few weeks later, and the total getting bet up to 54.5. I think both make sense. Both adjustments make perfectly sense from my point of view. At this point, I have not bet yet. I have not bet anything on that game yet. But at the current market price, I could not bet the Bengals. I just think that the Bengals, we talked about it, I think, prior to last week. The Bengals offense, they have a super low floor and a high ceiling. They have been so inconsistent on offense over the course of the season. We all remember all those highlight plays from Burrow to Jamar Chase. And if they really click on that connection, they can basically beat anyone. But we have not seen it very consistently, and we have not seen it very often. Rob Pizzola made a good point earlier on the Matchbook podcast that the Bengals have drawn basically the two easiest opponents in the AFC with the Raiders and the Titans, and they could not move the ball at all on them. They pretty much stank on offense, and if they don't really go a few steps up at Arrowhead, tough road environment with that offensive line against the Chiefs pass rush, I think it could be a very long game for them. And on the other side, what we saw a few weeks back, the Chiefs have no issue moving the ball on that defense. I mean,
Zero.
The Bengals defense, especially their pass defense, and now we are talking about early downs again. The Chiefs, one of the pass heaviest team on early downs. They have Patrick Mahomes. They just don't care about establishing the run too much. And that basically plays into the weakness of the Bengals defense, which cannot defend the pass very well. They had a few great interceptions last week, but this time it's Patrick Mahomes and not Ryan Tannehill with a few sloppy bounces. So I just don't see a clear path for the Bengals defense to have much success. I think the Chiefs will score. I mean, in week 16 or week 17, when it was, the Chiefs had 28 points at halftime with a crazy drop, or let's say great play from Eli Apple on Tyreek Hill right before halftime. So the Chiefs could have scored 31 points at halftime. And then in the second half, I mean, the Chiefs had 3 drives the whole second half. It was such a weird half with so few possessions. Then they had a couple mistakes on 3rd down, and all of a sudden you only have 3 drives. You don't score any more points. The Bengals played it perfectly and right into the failure of Andy Reid in the end. So I have no concerns about the Chiefs moving the ball. And I think then we get to a point that the spread and the total is probably a little bit correlated, because if the Bengals want to cover in this game, in my opinion, they have to score some points. And if they score some points and are able to cover, it's probably correlated with the over.
I was going to say the Chiefs did everything that you just mentioned too, without a fully healthy Travis Kelce and without McKinnon playing a snap, who obviously has emerged as a pretty influential player out of the backfield the last few weeks as defenses sort of really back off of trying to get any pressure or any sort of aggression on these receivers.
Exactly. I think we should take a look at Tyrann Mathieu. I would want him to play, because you don't want Daniel Sorensen playing any sort of deep coverage out there. So I think Tyrann Mathieu, if they don't have him, I don't really like that for the Chiefs, because then there's a path, or let's say there's a better path for the Bengals to score points. But when we think about a potential game script, it will be hard for the Bengals to stop the Chiefs. And if they cannot stop the Chiefs, then we are getting to a game script where the Chiefs are leading with a couple of scores. And then there's so much pressure on Joe Burrow and that offensive line in a tough road environment with a lot of crowd noise. And I'm not sure they are able to handle that.
That's we sort of forget at times just how young Joe Burrow is, and he's managed to, I would say, get away with the first 2 wins, not necessarily command or drive those wins, but now it's just in Arrowhead against a defense that's built for the Chiefs built to really play with the Chiefs have a lead. That just seems like a huge stage for him to ultimately be on. So if you do have something, everyone who is following you on Twitter at Suma810, that's SUUMA 810, may get a notification or a little bit of insight into which way you might be leaning on that one. Can we expect some live tweeting during the 2 games as well, like we got treated to last week?
Absolutely. For sure.
All right. He's a must follow. If you're not following him already, be sure to do that. Appreciate you sparing 20 minutes from your Wednesday evening with us here on Covers Daily.
Thanks, Adam. Have a good day.
Great. Chat soon. Fantastic stuff as always from Suma, and we're able to get everybody out and back to the day right at the 1 hour mark. We'll finish Patrick English. I know it is. The NASCAR discussion reading is plastic, plywood, and dirt, but I still don't understand it. I don't understand it either, but maybe we'll get some answers overnight. I appreciate again Suma stopping by. Great to hear some insight there. Also very comforting to know he is on the 49ers as well, alongside with me and a few other folks. But no question, certainly a battle on that number shaping up to be interesting to see where it closes. That'll do it for me today. Have a fantastic Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back with you tomorrow afternoon.